Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. This is where we talk to published authors about their latest piece of work. We also talk to them about their writing techniques, all kinds of best practices that we can implement in our own lives, our own writing lives, and make better. In the spotlight today is Joy Castro, and I've been really looking forward to this. Joy was featured on an email I received from Amazon. Amazon features authors from time to time, and I remember when I contacted her, she said, all these authors out there, why did you pick me? It's like, well, you got featured by Amazon, so I'm sure that's good for a spate of sales, to say the least. And also, the readout on her book, which is called Flight Risk, and I'll tease you with this one. A woman is forced to face her past in a heartbreaking and triumphant novel of old wounds and family secrets by award-winning author Joy Castro. I'll give you just a little bit more on this. Isabel Morales is a successful Chicago sculptor hiding a brutal family history, one not even her husband knows. After decades of turning her back on her past, she's forced to return to Appalachia when she receives news of her estranged mother's death. So we're talking dysfunction, secrets, interesting stuff. This is the kind of stuff that makes for really good reading. Joy Castro, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
We're glad to have you. And, in the interest of doing a little bit more foreshadowing, we'll also be talking to Joy about how to sustain productivity while working a demanding daytime job. She's a professor at the University of Nebraska, and she can check me on that after I'm done with this. Literary illusion and mythic archetypes in the novel, weaving research material into a novel without bogging down the narrative. And we'll even talk to her about book number 7. She's just published Flight Risk, yet she's got manuscript number 7 in the hands of her editor. And we'll see if she can tell us anything about that or whether she's superstitious. You never know with a writer. The superstition and writing go hand in hand, I think. So Joy, talk to us about Flight Risk. This is your new book. Tell us, I've given kind of this little sketch of it. And by the way, everybody, the background on Joy Castro, which I'll put in the program notes too, but she's an award-winning author of a post-Katrina New Orleans literary thriller named Hell or High Water, which she received the Nebraska Book Award for. She's also written one called Nearer Truth. And is that one also associated with Katrina?
Yeah, that's Nearer Home. It's a sequel to Hell or High Water. Yeah, it's also a literary thriller set in New Orleans. That's okay.
Okay, I said Nearer Truth, Nearer Home. Okay, so and there's other works as well, and she's appeared in magazines, including New York Times Magazine and Salon, as well as many others. Too numerous to mention, and she's a former writer in residence at Vanderbilt University. But she's currently a professor of English and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Nebraska. She's not really a Cornhusker. You grew up in Miami, is that right?
Well, I was born in Miami, and I lived there for 4 years in childhood, but at different times, in 2-year spates. And then I also lived in London as a little child. And then when I was 7 years old, my family moved to West Virginia. So we lived in rural Appalachia until I graduated from high school. And I moved away at that time to go to college. I lived in Texas to do my university degrees. And then I lived in Indiana for 10 years and then came to Lincoln. So I've been in Lincoln now for 14 years. I don't know if that makes me an honorary Husker or not, but I really like it here. So. Yeah,
I've been to Lincoln. I went to the Gallup organization, which is in Lincoln, Nebraska, and did that management training thing out there back with my previous company. And the nicest people. I mean, it's a flat landscape. It's not the prettiest state in the country, but the nicest people you'll ever meet. I mean, I understand why you like it out there. And a university setting is always a wonderful thing because you've got, young people who have great aspirations and they usually are quite optimistic about the future. They have big plans, and that's always just a beautiful thing.
It is. I love living in a college town. There's a lot to do, and it's also the state capital, so it's the seat of politics in Nebraska. And you're right that Nebraska's landscape has a subtle beauty, but it's there.
Too subtle for me, I guess. You have that nuanced view of a writer. You see these. I'm sure you write beautifully about the Nebraska plains, but I was a little bit lost. I mean, it was winter too, and it was a little encrusted with white snow. Well, basically not even white snow. It had been dirtied up a little bit, but nonetheless.
I hear you. Yeah, and the wind here is insane. I've been to a lot of windy places, but there's no wind like the prairie wind. Nothing stops it. It's so bitter and cutting. Yeah. So we do have really cold.
Nebraska's been called the Kuwait of wind power. The Kuwait of wind power. And I'll tell you one other place that I think will challenge Nebraska. Is the panhandle of Texas, which I spent a year in, and it blows in one direction continuously. I mean, trees or cacti, they literally will grow sideways. It's unbelievable.
Right. Yeah. I know one thing that they're doing here in Lincoln now is calling it the Silicon Prairie. They're trying to sort of sex up its business image a little bit and make it tech place, and I think there are a lot of new tech businesses opening here and attracting.
That's great to hear. Is the university has a strong tech program, like a computer science program or biomedical program?
A great computer science program, wonderful engineering school, and so on. So, yeah.
So I'm going to ask you that cliche question that people ask, the question you don't really want to hear, which is this autobiographical, family secrets, estranged people, and I know that your mom, from doing a little bit of research, is a Jehovah's Witness, and you're adopted. Is that right, Joy? Anything I get into here that you don't want to talk about, you just might say, Mike, I'll take the fifth on that one, move on. But I've just thrown a couple items at you that I'm thinking maybe this plays into the book in some way. What would you say?
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be asked about those kinds of things, even though they're personal. I wrote a memoir that talked about my pretty dysfunctional childhood. I did run away from home at 14 when my home had become very violent and scary. Let's see, I don't want to give any spoilers for the novel.
Yeah, you don't want to give those away.
Yeah.
But the memoir is called The Truth Book, is that right?
That's right, yep. And then there was a follow-up book of essays about being a mother and a professor and a writer coming from that kind of background, which is a bit unusual to come from poverty and violence, and then try to juggle those different roles while trying to be a healthy person in the world. So that book was called Island of Bones. And so I have two books out in the world with some pretty personal things. So it's okay to talk about. Some things in Flight Risk are based on my personal knowledge and experience, but not all the things happened to me. Some of the things were things I saw. Some of the things were things I wished happened, right? So fiction gives you that freedom to invent and retell things. There's one episode in the novel where Isabel, the protagonist, is asked to a pivotal dinner by her boss. And it's very much based on something that happened to me when I was 19, but not in New York City, as in the novel, rather in San Antonio, where I was. But I made the opposite decision from the decision Isabel makes. So, it's sort of like, fiction lets you explore the path not taken and imagine what the ramifications would have been if you made a different choice. So I've had a lot of fun with that in the novel.
Now, I have no doubt that your memoirs, well, the Truth Book and Island of Bones, were cathartic. But do you also find that fiction writing, you've written how many novels now?
Flight Risk is the third, and then I've written a fourth, as you mentioned. So
do you think it's, do you find fiction writing cathartic as well?
And a book of short stories. To an extent, I do. I find I'm not even sure catharsis is the right word, but there's something really transformative for me as a writer in taking an emotional truth or a fragment of something that happened and then shaping it into an aesthetic form that gives pleasure, right? So it could be a fragmented form. It could be a form that unfolds backwards chronologically. It could be a form patterned on a fairy tale, as Flight Risk is, but whatever the form is, somehow shaping material that's painful or traumatic or unresolved brings a kind of resolution to it. So there is a kind of satisfying closure at the aesthetic level that happens for me as a maker. So you take something that was raw and ragged and maybe even uncontrollable in your real life, and you shape it and you make it into something that you do control and you give it a form. And I find that to be very transformative and moving. It's a beautiful experience. Like when the form comes to you as you're writing and you're like, aha, I know what the last line is, and now I just have to write as fast as I can to get there. That's a really exciting feeling when the shape emerges as you're working and you're like, aha, that's a gorgeous feeling. So I really love that.
I know exactly what you're talking about. It's such a heady feeling when a book will develop as you're writing it. I mean, some people do a very strict outline. I've never been real tied to that sort of thing, but I understand where I'm going with it to start, but I don't really know where it's going to end. And when you have that realization, which is kind of an epiphany, it just feels... all of a sudden, you know that you're on the right track, and because I've abandoned past efforts, and most people probably have. I suspect that you have as well. Haven't you started something that you? I mean, the first two things I ever wrote, I wrote myself into a corner and abandoned them. I'm wondering, did you ever write? Were you writing something at a point and just decided either that, like me, you wrote yourself into a corner, or that this is just not energizing me. It's not happening the way I want it to, and I'm not enjoying the process, and I'm not energized by it. So I'm going to find something that's a richer channel.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, not with this book, Flight Risk, but there's a passage or section in my memoir, The Truth Book, that describes a really shattering thing that happened when my brother and I were kids. And I had been trying to write that since I was in graduate school. I did a scholarly master's and a scholarly PhD, but I was taking writing workshops occasionally on the side, just for my own pleasure. And I tried in poetry, I tried in prose, and I just didn't have the skills. I did not have the craft skills. I didn't have the whatever it is that it was going to take to pull that off. And so I kept writing that scene over and over in different forms, same material, but different ways into it, different language for it. And it took me until, I guess I was like 30. It was in my early 30s when I drafted The Truth Book. Yeah. So it took a long time.
The same scene done repeatedly. That's not unlike making a TV show or movie where it's like take 3, take 5, take 25. It's the same scene. It's the same actors. You're trying to accomplish the same thing, but it just isn't right. And you do take after take. I mean, I don't think at all that you're alone in this technique. You do take after take until what you feel there is authenticity.
You're exactly right about the analogy with film, take 1, take 2. That's very interesting. I don't know about authenticity, but yeah, it has to really ring true.
It feels right
to me. Yeah, it has to really feel right, and it has to have a shape,
And
it has to have pleasing
don't
shape.
you write a lot of stuff that, I mean, any author writes a lot of stuff where you feel like this sounds like writing. It sounds like a person trying to write a novel instead of somebody who's really communicating at a level where it's not sounding like writing as much as it's something that somebody can actually be immersed in.
Like a kind of transparency in the prose.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's beautiful when the language sort of gets out of the way and you feel like you're communing with another spirit, another intellect. I love it as a reader when that happens, so I do try to make that happen as a writer. I'm not sure how often I succeed, but absolutely you do want to get your mannerisms and your little verbal tics out of the way. And any feeling of striving. I mean, it's so interesting when you're in a creative writing workshop or you're talking to a writer friend and you say, oh, this feels so effortless. And they always laugh, and I laugh too, because the effortless passages are often the ones that took the most agony and work, right, to get them to that state of transparency and lucidity and effortlessness. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes, and you've probably had this experience a lot too, sometimes things come almost like a gift, like you're just taking dictation from the air, from the muses or whatever. But a lot of the time it's labor. It's sheer labor.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. About the labor part, I wish that I more often felt that I was taking dictation from a higher power of some sort, so that it was just something that was simple and more enjoyable. But I did want to get back to this whole thing about effortlessness. Are you talking about during, obviously when the muse is dictating to you, let's say, that's obviously effortless, but do you also sometimes find that you try too hard while you're writing, and if you back off of that effort at times, don't try to make it work, but to just relax into it a little bit, that the writing comes out more true? I don't mean true in terms of factually, I mean true in terms of purity.
An experience that I have or a process or technique that I use that kind of helps me to get into that state of not trying so hard is that I like to write first thing in the morning before I even get out of bed. I know that sounds weird, but like I don't go to a desk and get all serious. Like I have my notebook next to the bed on the nightstand, and as soon as I wake up, I begin writing because I'm still sort of in that, dream state, and things come smoothly. My critical judging editor self hasn't kicked in for the day yet. I haven't checked email or, social media or talked to anyone. And when I can do that, I am sort of in that state that people refer to as flow. Yes. And then, yes, it comes easily and smoothly, and I don't feel like I'm straining or trying. Yeah. But I've always, since early childhood, loved writing. It's my vice. It's my go-to pleasure. I jump into it for fun when I have spare time. I always have a notebook. So it does feel kind of delicious most of the time.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to ask you. I know that you came to loving books and reading and writing early in life. And let's get back to that in a minute, because I want to stick with this writing process of yours.
Sure.
Because I heard you talking to somebody else about, you really try to immerse yourself, it sounds like. I mean, the morning, that morning time, obviously you're coming out of a dream state, and you're not getting distracted by, as you say, social media or phone calls or anything of that sort yet. But at the same time, you're a full-time professor who's got an alarm clock, maybe, and needs to be in class. Are these on off days? Are you able, how are you able to immerse yourself? I guess this is getting to the question that I foreshadowed about sustaining productivity. When you've got a classroom full of people, multiple classes that you teach, you have to grade papers, you have to interact with them. It takes a lot of brain power there, and time consuming, and yet at the same time you want to continue to keep a steady connection to the writing and putting in your hours. So talk about your writing process in sustaining and dealing with a day job like so many of us do.
Absolutely. And I guess I would say two things in response to that. One is that because I had a child when I was 20 and was putting myself through undergraduate and then 2 graduate degrees while raising him, part of the time as a single mother, I learned early to be very disciplined, like to make the most of 10 minutes, to make the most of whenever he was asleep or happily playing with his Legos or, any scrap of time, like between classes in the quiet hallway at the university. So I wrote really short things for a long time because of that, but they did accrete over time. Mm-hmm. And then when he was older, when I had a job as a professor, it all seemed like luxury, like total luxury, to have, to be able to say, okay, now I'm going to take this hour or these 2 hours on a Saturday. And that was really terrific. So, and also I was, I wasn't always the best professor. Like I get really bored to this day during most faculty meetings and committee meetings and meetings. So, sometimes if I didn't have an integral role, where I had to be ready to speak at any moment, I would write during the faculty meetings. Right? Like I was like the bad kid in the back of the classroom or something.
Doodling away. Did you ever turn any of the people in that meeting room into a character, like, or just see some physical features that you thought, oh, that will work with this character? Do you ever pilfer from the room?
No, never, because writing is a way of escaping where I am. So, yeah. If I wanted to be in that room, I probably would have been paying attention.
Yes.
So,
Exactly.
It was a way to be somewhere else. But the other part of my answer to that question is, as a teacher, I've had many summers off, not all summers. Sometimes I've taught during the summer, and now I'm an academic administrator as well. So I'm on the clock 12 months a year. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethnic Studies. It's an academic unit here at the University of Nebraska. And so during those summers that I did have off, or during my occasional and precious research leaves, like when professors get a whole semester to just go do their own work without teaching, like that is when I could just completely dive into the world of the novel. So that's when I could draft new long works, book-length works, would be during a summer or during a semester-long research leave. And then during the school years, busy, as you say, with classes and so on, I can take 15 minutes and revise a page, right, and feel like I'm moving the project forward. But what's really hard is trying to get very immersed when your attention is so fragmented. So I know that there are a lot of writers who are like, I get up at 4 a.m. and write before anyone's awake, and I just take my hat off to them. I am too much of a sleeper. I really am. I rely on dreams. I write late at night sometimes when people are asleep, or in the summers I write in the morning, or if I don't have class till later in the day, I'll write in the morning. But I pretty much write every morning, but some of it is real throwaway. It's like taking out the mental trash. It's journaling. It's not, or excavating, right? Like generating new things, but it's not
a keeper necessarily.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. You want to Julia Cameron calls it laying track. You just want to,
yes.
You need to produce the raw material, and then you get that iron ore from it, or whatever analogy you want to use. So interesting that, let's go back to bed. You wake up in the morning, and you're writing. To begin with, are you using a pen and paper?
I do. I've written all of my books longhand, or I've drafted them all.
Whether you're in bed or not. I mean, because obviously a laptop doesn't, well, I mean, a laptop could work in bed, but first thing in the morning, you may not want to mess with that. So let me ask you this. You've heard of the technique where if you go to bed at night and you're thinking about a problem, oftentimes you will wake up in the morning with the solution. Your brain goes to work on it during the night, and you will wake up with an answer. And it's not anything hocus pocus. It's just the subconscious mind has time to work on it. Do you ever go to bed at night with your scene on your mind, a character on your mind, the novel itself on your mind, and then wake up in the morning feeling that you have had any kind of breakthrough or are particularly inspired?
100%, actually. I maybe I'm too much of a teacher, but I give my brain the assignment as I'm falling asleep. And with Flight Risk, I didn't outline at all. You were mentioning rigorous outlines earlier. But with the two literary thrillers, I did write pretty elaborate chapter, like an outline where there was a paragraph for each chapter of both of those novels. And before bed, I would read the paragraph of the next day's chapter. So I would have it in my mind, and then I would go to sleep, and then I would wake up and I would write the chapter before I got out of bed. Just, blaze through the whole book longhand, and when I was done, then I would type it up. But yeah, definitely the unconscious is a tremendous problem solver. It's a wild, maniacal artist genius, and I rely on it every chance I can.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, giving yourself an assignment as you fall asleep at night, that's a really interesting way to put it. And there's, like you say, the professor in you. So what about as an English professor, are you giving them writing assignments? Is it like a literature class? Are you having them write things?
At the current moment, I'm teaching a graduate course in writing literary nonfiction. So that's really what we're doing all semester. They're writing things, and then we're reading and workshopping their work, and then we read essays by published authors as well, and sort of analyze those essays, figure out how they work. And then we've been, I think I mentioned to you, I was doing a webinar series where we then interview those published authors on screen and ask them about that single essay that we've all read in advance. So yes, when I'm teaching creative writing, that's absolutely what I do. And then when I teach literature, I teach Chicanx poetry, so contemporary poetry by Mexican American writers. I teach modernism, so Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, Catherine Mansfield. So I teach a lot of literature. So we read a lot, and then it's mostly analytical, and the students write argumentative essays based on their careful, close reading and research about the book.
Now, who influenced you the most in terms of authors? Can you name off a few different authors who you feel like were great influences on you, or that you just simply cherish?
Oh, absolutely. This is, I think, every writer's favorite question. I love Catherine Mansfield. She was a modernist from New Zealand who then relocated to England and then to the European continent. And she wrote incredible short stories, just jewel-like, brilliant short stories. And people refer to her as one of the three progenitors of the modern short story, along with James Joyce and Anton Chekhov. So I fell in love with her work when I was a high school student and have never stopped loving her work. I also really am grateful to Sandra Cisneros, whose book, The House on Mango Street, just opened huge doors for me as a young Latina writer searching for, models or I don't know, someone to emulate, someone whose life that I could connect with. And she has said that she started writing that book because she was in the Iowa MFA program, the very famous program, and she just felt out of place and disconnected from the students there who at that time were typically very privileged students, and she was, I think, maybe the only or one of the only writers of color, and she was from an extremely economically disadvantaged urban background. And she said, what she had to write about were third floor flats and fear of rats and like people throwing a brick through the window. And she just felt out of place in her workshop. So she started writing the things that were true for her. And that's how that first book of fiction happened. And it's so poetic, and the form is so gorgeous with the linked vignettes that all sort of add up to a circle. It's like the form of the Epic of Gilgamesh in a way. Anyway, see, this is really, yeah. And I love Middlemarch, George Eliot's fat Victorian novel of a whole village and loves and loss. That would be my desert island book. And The Bluest Eye knocked me out. But like I've taught whole seminars on Faulkner, and I'm very much in love with contemporary writers, many as well, too many to name. Angela Carter. I really am blown away by what she did with fairy tales, the subversion and inversion of fairy tales to reveal other meanings or new meanings embedded in them. And again, that was an influence on me in terms of flight risk and using the Grimm Brothers fairy tale, the Six Swans, as a kind of archetypal structure for that story. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. So I'm in the classroom. Our listeners are in the classroom. You're giving us some writing instruction. What are some of the chief things that you try to communicate? I mean, this is assuming you have some students that, I want to be a novelist, or I want to be a creative nonfiction writer. Let's stick with novelist, because there are differences there. What are some of the things, kind of the bedrock principles that you teach them from your experience? What are some of those bedrock principles that you need to apply to and I understand everybody's different, but you're being asked. So what would you say?
Yeah, right. Well, one that was really drilled into me when I was in workshop was show, don't tell. Mm-hmm. And for me, that works beautifully in fiction or nonfiction, actually. I think that for me, if I can select exactly the right scene or the right detail and show it without much commentary at all, just framing it in particular word choices so that the reader sees it in a particular way. And then I stack the scenes together, juxtaposing them so that they kind of talk to each other and reflect on each other. If I can do that, then I don't really need to tell the reader what's going on or what I think about it all. They'll be able to figure that out pretty well on their own, and they'll have a more vivid and visceral experience as they do, because they'll be immersed in the sensory images and the dialogue and the action and the bodily sensations. So they'll be having a kind of vicarious experience, and they won't need me to do the math for them. Now, Interestingly, Matthew Salesses, in his brilliant new book, just came out this year, from Catapult, called Craft in the Real World, he does a really terrific job of undoing some of the standard principles of the creative writing workshop and craft education in the United States today, things like show, don't tell. He says, that emerges from a particular cultural tradition, and not every culture favors that. There are cultures whose storytelling traditions are absolutely relying on the telling part of storytelling. So he does a really fantastic job, and I recommend that book to any serious writer or aspiring writer. Absolutely check out Matthew Sales's book, Craft in the Real World, because he's upending a lot of the received wisdom that writers who've gone through literary education in a collegiate setting have imbibed. So he's really problematizing it and questioning it. That's really super useful.
You talk about show, don't tell, and I think that is kind of difficult at times, but I think one of the places where writers fall down, from my own experience in reading writers, I feel oftentimes that they make a statement, and it's almost like that statement that they've made is enough, but they add to it. They go deeper. And it's what you're talking about is in large part trusting the reader, that the reader makes connections, the reader is with you, the reader is tracking, and that you don't have to spoon feed the reader everything. I mean, does that make any sense or not?
It makes complete sense. As a reader, I don't like to be spoon-fed. I like the writer to assume that I'm paying attention, that I'm bright enough to figure things out. So I love making leaps, as long as there's enough there, for the awake reader to follow. I really love making leaps and not spelling things out, because I think the reading experience is so much more active and engaging if the reader has to work a little bit to make meaning. Now, I'm not a big fan of work that's so opaque and obscure that the average intelligent bear can't make sense of it. Like, it's interesting to read super experimental writing, like yay, Finnegan's Wake, but that's not the kind of work that I'm doing on the page. Right. I want to be much more inclusive than that. But definitely, I deeply respect the intelligence, the innate intelligence of the reader. I assume they're probably smarter than I am, and I try and make the experience a pleasure for them, like a puzzle, and a pleasure with suspense and payoff.
Right. Well, and if a person's reading, that tells you something right there. I mean, the fact that they're reading means that they're looking for something. They're educated. By and large, they're going to be educated, and they're looking for some of the subtleties in life. I mean, what's remarkable, getting back to what you were saying, is how little sometimes you have to say for the reader to really understand it. And two of the people I think of, one is Milan Kundera, who I think of his writing as almost like a gesture drawing. It's very sketchy. And sketchy by, what I mean by sketchy is that he gives you scenes and characters, but he doesn't give you a lot of detail. He allows you to actually fill in these open spaces. And then I just read the memoir from Joyce Maynard, the woman who lived with J.D. Salinger and wrote the memoir At Home in the World, beautifully written. And she also would come up short on stuff. There were so many sentences that ended, or so many places in that memoir that ended, and I thought, a lesser writer would have said something more. They would have extended that out. The sentence would have been longer, and they probably would have added another sentence or two, trying to illuminate, thinking that they're illuminating, but what they're really doing is stealing the scene from the reader. Exactly. If you want everything filled in, and you don't want any participation, you go to a movie, because the director makes all the decisions. You don't get to make any decisions. You don't get to do any work, and you don't get to do any play. So, but, when you're reading, a good writer lets you fill in those open spaces. And I think too often you get writers who are extremely detailed about everything and really just don't trust that the reader, they probably don't trust themselves as the issue, and therefore don't trust the reader. They're a little insecure about whether they're communicating properly or not.
Mike, when I read The Unbearable Lightness of Being as a college student, it blew the doors off my mind. I was like, Kundera is the
landmark
bomb.
book, you know.
Oh my goodness,
Tell me about
it was
your experience
incredible.
with it. Tell me about your experience.
I think it was so intellectually and aesthetically thrilling to read his metafictional commentary, like, oh, he's talking about Nietzsche, and now he's going to talk about a scene in which Tomas and Teresa are doing something, right? And then he's going to talk about the fact that he just made that scene up, right? This was my first, I want to come back and problematize something you said earlier, but that was my first experience of metafiction. And I was just amazed. I was like, whoa, we can do that? You know, we're allowed to do that? It was so gorgeous and fantastic. It wasn't assigned in any of my courses in undergraduate, but it was like a book that was lying around on everybody's table in their dorm rooms. Like, everyone was just devouring it. And so I think I borrowed it from a friend and then was just blown away by it. It was revelatory. It was absolutely revelatory for me.
It was for me too. Also, the book, the first one I read from him was the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, which I really loved that one.
Yeah.
There was the end part where he went into stream of consciousness, where I wasn't as hep to that, but it was he's like writing, and it's kind of like, wow, he's like giving. It's like it's a story, obviously. It's clearly a story, and he's got these characters, and you want to know more about him, but he really, makes you, I don't know, there's a lot of breadcrumbs. There's a lot of breadcrumbs you got to follow.
Right, yeah.
You were going to get back to something else you said we were talking about earlier?
Yeah. There were two things you said that I want to problematize just a tiny bit. So one of them is the notion that people who are reading are probably educated. And, I came from a home where that wasn't the case, interestingly. Like, both of my parents, they graduated high school, but that was it. And my grandmother didn't make it through school at all. And no one in our circle was college educated, no one at all, because of the religious milieu in which we lived. And yet, we read for pleasure. I'm not sure that we were reading for nuance or subtlety, but my mother read the Jehovah's Witness one. She read John Jake's novels and Michener novels as a pleasurable way to learn about history. So she was somebody who hadn't had college available to her, but she read those books to learn about history. My father read, I think, like true crime sometimes. There was often a book around the house, but I don't really remember the kinds of things that he read. But, I devoured any book that I could find. And really, they were a window into another world. And I think even if someone's not educated in any formal way, that almost everyone out there is curious and smart and interested in the world. And some people come to reading early so that it's easy for them, and other people find reading laborious, or they come to it late, or it's difficult, or it's a pain. So they never have that experience of just diving or being able to dive smoothly into a book and forgetting that they're working at the labor of reading. But for those of us who are lucky enough to just read early and easily, then books open up an entire universe. And I think people love to read whether they're educated or not. And my books, because I know that world so well, the world of poverty and really nearly enforced ignorance, but I know the curiosity and intelligence of the people who live there. I try really hard. I fail sometimes, being a professor now and everything. I try really hard to make all of my books as accessible as possible. I think, could my grandmother understand this if she were alive? Could she read this and find pleasure? She watched soap operas, telenovelas, and I try to make my work accessible enough so that that she could read it or my father could enjoy it, while embedding all these cool things that I like as a literature professor in there too. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that I loved that you said, like, if people don't want to make decisions, they could go to a movie. I would say that some of the most interesting directors are the ones who also leave gaps and ask the viewer to leap, and I don't know, there are just a lot of films that I've been watching in the last few years that do that, and that fascinate me because they expect intellectual labor from the viewer. So I think you're right on the whole about the difference between movies or visual media like TV shows and books, but some not so much. So anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you that there are, for instance, I love a movie that has an open ending. My wife hates it, but I love an open ending because it allows us to walk away and then sit down, have a coffee or a glass of wine and discuss it. If it's all tied up in a bow at the end, it's like there's nothing left to discuss. I mean, we could say, well, that scene was this or that, but you get to the end of a good movie and there is an open ending, or you don't know what the final decision or resolution is, then it's all the more interesting to me. It frustrates my wife, but interesting to me. And I think it frustrates a lot of movie viewers, which is why there's so few movies that have an open ending. And I love novels that end, with open endings as well, where there's something to really think about, to cogitate on for however long it's of interest or fascination. Now, we were just talking about Milan Kundera, and you did mention in the notes that you sent me that you were interested in talking about literary allusions in mythic archetypes in novels. What did you want to say about that? What could you tell us?
Yeah. Well, I think because I was trained as a literary scholar of modernist literature, I was immersed in texts that use mythic archetypes. I think the modernists were really huge in that regard, like James Joyce patterning Ulysses on the Odyssey, or T.S. Eliot patterning the wasteland on the Grail myth. The poet H.D. Referred to a lot of Greek myth in her work, as did the more accessible, formally conventional poet of the period, Edna St. Vincent Millay. So I've always been really interested in that ability to take an ancient story, a mythic story, and update it in ways that are meaningful and accessible for readers now. So, like in the first New Orleans novel that I published, Hell or High Water, I was using a Cajun legend, as befits New Orleans, the myth of the Rougarou, and I won't say a lot about it. It's a super interesting myth, sort of like a werewolf, but not really. And so I was using that myth, and then I was using some of the religious imagery from Santeria, kind of syncretic Cuban religion that grew out of Yoruba, African religion, and so I was using some of the imagery of the Orishas and so on, but in a really subtle way, like, like color imagery and things like that to characterize some of the people in that novel. And that was great fun to make it all work, and to not have it be heavy-handed, So that if you're a reader and you're very familiar with Santeria, you're going to go, oh, wow, wait, this is this little special extra thing for me, like a little surprise gift, a toy in the Happy Meal. But if you don't know that, or then you don't. It's fine. Nothing's missing for you from the story. You don't need to have that to enjoy the narrative. And similarly with Flight Risk, and I mentioned in Flight Risk the fairy tale, The Six Swans, and I kind of spell it out a little bit. There's a part where the protagonist, Isabel, thinks about it, and I had it be her little brother's favorite story, so she could kind of think it through in the text in an organic feeling way, rather than it being like a drop-in lecture. And then there are a number of resonances with the story in which she finds herself as a character. So there's this weird mother-in-law in Six Swans, and Isabel has a strange controlling mother-in-law, and there's a story of the princess's love for her brother in the Six Swans, and so too is that part of the plot of Flight Risk. And then it's an unusual fairy tale in that it takes the protagonist girl to the point of marriage, but then keeps going. Most fairy tales end with happily ever after, and the Six Swans really sort of deconstructs that myth itself and shows that happily ever after can be sort of gruesome and awful. And Isabel is finding herself in a marriage where the trust has eroded, and she has to figure out what to do. So in Flight Risk, Six Swans is very important.
A lot of novelists, there's many of them that do a lot of research.
Yeah.
And I think of Tom Wolfe as one who, my goodness, he'd do a tremendous amount of research. But I remember just researching topics within something I've been writing, and then as I go to apply it, I realize, I'm getting into, this stuff is fascinating, but I'm getting into more detail than it's going to fascinate most people. So I really need to kind of put the brakes on this stuff. What about integrating research material into the story without bogging down the narrative? Because I always think in terms, personally, I think in terms of the velocity of copy. You want that copy to move. So I think of forward. I try to think in terms of not having speed bumps in there, unless it's for effect. There's times when you want to slow things down because it's a moment in the book that might be, it could be anything. It could be a meditative moment. It could be a stark scene or what have you. So obviously you want to modulate, but at the same time, when it comes to research, you don't want to overdo the research in terms of dumping it on the reader. It could almost become like a notebook dump. How do you approach that?
Absolutely, and I love the way you put that. The phrase, the velocity of copy, is great. And yes, you never want a passage in your work to feel like a Wikipedia info dump. For me, the thing that I like to do, because I do tons of research on various topics to write a novel. It's the scholar in me. I just love to learn a bunch of things. But then I guess what I do is absorb it. I try to absorb it so thoroughly and then basically forget it. I do not write with my notes in front of me or reference materials open in front of me. I try to really make it as much a part of me as I can. And then when I'm drafting, the right detail will come to mind. I just sort of have to have that trust that in the moment of conjuring a scene, the correct specific specific, obscure detail will suddenly surface in my consciousness, and then I can weave it in effortlessly, or seemingly effortlessly, and smoothly, so that it doesn't disrupt the narrative flow. It doesn't feel like I've paused to give a mini lecture. I think that's really important. It should be what John Gardner in The Art of Fiction calls profluent, that forward rush that you mentioned,
yes.
and the vivid and continuous dream in his famous phrase. So, I do buy that. I do think that we only should rupture the dream as writers when we intend to, like Kundera saying, well, now that I've put Teresa in front of the window, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came up with it, right? So, like, for moments like that, or as you say, if things need to pause or things need to be rocky or disruptive, okay, fine, but that should always be our intention. We shouldn't just flog our readers with every fascinating factoid that we learned in our research. Unfortunately, a lot of it will drop away.
Yeah. And, I made the mistake of having the notes right there and then trying to transfer it over in some kind of literary fashion, and it does not work well. And oddly enough, I should know better, because one of the things I've done as an editor with reporters when I was I used to be a writing and reporting coach for one of the companies I worked for. And one of the points I made with them is write the story without your notes. You can always fill in the finer details later, but you know the story. You've reported it. You've got the notebook there, but don't be opening it up. Just write the story, and then you go back and retrofit it with the finer details. You don't have to have the number exactly right on when you're just blowing through it, and just making sure that you're building out the structure of it. And stories tend to come out a lot better that way. Anyway, and obviously what you're talking about here with fiction writing, I think, and the research, integrating that research, it just makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about...
I was just going to say, I completely agree. Exactly.
Yeah, and I want to get to book number 7. It's a manuscript at this stage, on its way to becoming a book. What can you tell us about it? Can you tell us the title? Can you tell us the premise? Are you superstitious about this? Oftentimes writers don't want to reveal, for good reason, you don't want to reveal too much, but what can you say about it?
Sure. I can't tell you the title because I had what I thought was the perfect gem-like title, and we can't go with it because there's another book that's been published a few years ago, and my publisher doesn't want to go with it, alas. So we're right now brainstorming titles, and I hope we come up with something really fantastic. But what I can tell you is that it's a historical novel of political intrigue. It's set in 1886 in Key West, Florida, which was at that time the, I think, largest and definitely the most prosperous city in Florida. And that was largely due to the cigar industry. Post-Civil War tariffs had made it not financially feasible to import cigars from Cuba, but very financially feasible to import the raw tobacco. And Key West has as you may know, and your listeners might know, a very humid, very warm climate, so that the tobacco leaves would stay moist and fresh until they could be rolled into cigars. So it was a booming business. Millions of cigars a year were hand-rolled in Key West and then were exported all over the world. And interestingly, the industry was mostly Cuban. They were Cuban cigar rollers who had fled the 30 Years' War in Cuba, which was an anti-colonial insurgency against Imperial Spain, which still ruled Cuba at the time and would rule it until 1898. And there was a fire, a huge fire in Key West in 1886. That's a fact. All this part is factual. a huge fire, and they called it the Great Fire of Key West, and it destroyed 18 cigar factories, the town hall, churches, over 600 homes. It left people, bereft. And arson was suspected at the time, either Spaniards trying to burn down the rebel base, because Key West was where Cubans would gather money and munitions to carry on the guerrilla fight against the Spaniards in Cuba. Or people thought that it could have been factory owners, interestingly, burning down their own factories to get the insurance and move the labor force up to Tampa, where the white law enforcement agencies had already promised to put down strikes by any means necessary. And they did get quite violent there in Tampa. Whereas in Key West, the Cuban population was large enough and powerful enough that they really couldn't quite be controlled. When the workers would go on strike, which was frequently, for better labor conditions, the other Cubans in the community would support them. The grocers and the bakers and so on would make sure that they didn't go hungry so that they could sustain a strike. And so the factory owners did not like that. So anyway, to my novel, it features 6 young people, 3 young women and 3 young men, all of whom narrate chapters throughout the book. There are 100 chapters, and all of whom have serious motive to want Key West to burn. So we read the novel, and we know that there was a fire. We know from the first chapter that there was going to be a fire, but we don't know who did it or why until the final chapter. So I can tell you that, and it's
and different chapters are narrated by each of those 6 characters.
Yes,
so they have these varying perspectives.
They do, yes. Some are wealthy, like there's the Cuban daughter of a factory owner who wants to become a modern American woman. There's a lector. So a custom in the factories then was that a hired person, hired by the workers, not by the owner, would be up on this high stand and would read to the cigar rollers all day the newspapers, political theory like Marx and Engels and Bakunin, so anarchism and Marxism, and then in the afternoons would read novels like Les Miserables or Don Quixote or The Count of Monte Cristo, sort of these humanitarian or swashbuckling novels. So the cigar rollers were quite educated and cosmopolitan and aware of world events and world literature, but it was all auditory. Anyway, so one of the characters is a young man who's a lector. One of the young men is a guerrilla fighter. And there's a young woman who's a cigar roller, because women worked in the factories right next to men. People of all races and ethnicities worked at the cigar benches next to each other. So it's kind of this utopian moment when they were all working together for Cuban freedom and for their own freedom. I think it was a fascinating time period and almost completely unknown in U.S. history. And so I'm sort of restoring it, I hope, to the public imagination and telling a cracking good tale while I'm doing it.
A cracking good tale. I love that. It sounds so connected to your ethnic studies background and your education and what you teach. And I suspect that the post-Katrina book you wrote, Hell or High Water, was that also very much connected to your ethnic studies, being that New Orleans is such an ethnically rich stew?
Absolutely, for sure. The Key West novel is connected to me personally in a way that the 2 New Orleans novels are not, but certainly the 2 New Orleans novels feature a young Cuban-American journalist from a background of poverty who's working on important stories of violence and crime and of political corruption. And her best friends are a young Chicana and then two young African-American women, all from New Orleans. And so they, I had been influenced as a young woman in the 90s by those episodes of Sex and the City, with the four friends. Was it four? Yeah, it was four friends. Navigating the world of work and ambition, but also sex and romance. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if those were young women of color? So yes, in those two books, that's definitely connected with my ethnic studies training and background. But the Key West novel, that's actually my own family's experience. My great-great-grandmother came to Key West from Cuba in 1869 with her brood of children, widowed because of the war, and grew up. The children grew up in Key West, and her son, my great-grandfather, wrote an account in Spanish of that time period, his memoirs. And we found that, my brother and I found that when our father died, and we didn't know what to make of it. And slowly over time, we've translated it with my son's help. He's a beautiful translator from the Spanish. My Spanish is really terrible. And my brothers too. We're both quite rueful about it. Then my grandfather was a lecturer in cigar factories in Tampa and Key West, and he was also a poet and a journalist. So I've really drawn on that history for the novel, and then a ton of research, because growing up I didn't know anything about it. Our family never talked about it. We really didn't know about that past of ours until our father died, and then I didn't learn about that period of U.S. history until a couple of years ago. There was a National Endowment for the Humanities seminar down in Tampa about Cuban cigar towns, specifically Tampa and Key West, in the late 19th century, and Jose Marti and the whole, Cuban revolutionary movement at that time. And so I went and did that month-long seminar and read a million books and learned so much that I wish I had known growing up. But now I know it.
I also had heard that you went to University of Texas. Is that where you went to school?
I did not, no. I went to Trinity University in San Antonio.
In San Antonio. Okay, Trinity.
Yep.
And, you said college transformed your life. I heard you say that in an interview I had heard, and it did the exact same thing to me. It did the exact same thing. I went to Arizona State University, and I went there when I was interested in sports and rock and in music, but only rock music. And I met people from Iran and during the hostage crisis and on and on. It was a transformational experience for sure. It was I couldn't have done anything better than, of course, go to college. It was and it wasn't in the best of it wasn't even in the classroom, although that was tremendous too. Talk about your transformation. You said it really kind of transformed your life. So speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely, and I'm glad to hear about your experience. I was forbidden to go to college growing up as a Jehovah's Witness. That was something that we were told to never do. Now I think things have loosened up for Jehovah's Witnesses somewhat, and their students do go to college, which is wonderful. But when I was growing up, that was not the policy. And so just dreaming about college was forbidden. I remember one time I had a novel that I had checked out from the high school library about a girl who goes to college, and my mother made me return the novel. She said, I do not want you filling your head with dreams like that. So it was absolutely forbidden, and so I think that made me want it even more. I mean, you would think that religious people, knowing the Garden of Eden story, would not turn college into a temptation for their kids. So it was inevitable that I really wanted to go to college, and getting there, it was like paradise. It was a world of books, and incredibly curious,
what did you
intellectually rich. Well, I thought I was going to major in political science, and that's what I took a lot of at first, and I became quickly disillusioned and frustrated. And so I ended up majoring in English. It was the only thing I could really do well, was analyze text. So I did take some interesting religion courses, like Asian religions, women and religion. Like, I think I was trying to figure out ways of getting a more distanced perspective on the whole phenomenon of religion. And I remember doing well in those courses and being encouraged to major, but I was like, nah, I had enough of religion. But, I wanted to see other perspectives. And that's where I started reading the Tao Te Ching, which I read pretty much annually. And
as in Taoism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. It's really,
that
when
was
people
one of the
ask,
transformational experiences I had. Was I took a world religions class as an elective, and it was about Buddhism. It was the Buddha going through planes of consciousness and meditation, and there was Taoism and Zoroastrianism, and Hinduism and reincarnation, and that just completely opened my mind up to, and it. Frankly, it just made so much more sense. Some of them made so much more sense to me than Christianity. I was raised a Catholic, and it was like, this really doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
There's a lot of this stuff that seems contradictory, or it's like, I don't even have to go into that. You get it. And but there, a lot of the other religions were kind of filled in a lot of those blanks, just a lot more possibilities there. And I've always been spiritually inclined, but I've never tied myself to any particular religion other than when I was first growing up. But that was a real mind expansion sort of thing. Let me ask you this. I want to get back to the writing of it, back to your novels. How long does it take you to write a novel? I mean, if you were to average it out between the 4 novels you've written.
It really does vary. So,
what's the longest and shortest?
Okay, that's easier. I think Flight Risk probably, because I started it in 2013, and here we are. It's just coming out. It went through a lot of different iterations, and then the shortest really were the Nearer Home and the one that I've just turned in, because in both cases I had 2 book contracts and the publisher wanted the second one within a year. So I was like, all right, okay, I'll knock it out. And it's very difficult to write a whole book within a year. It's a tremendous kind of pressure. Usually I like to let things simmer for much longer, but some people who read Nearer Home, the sequel to Hell or High Water, liked it better. They said it was leaner and more intense, right?
Interesting.
And my editor is really wild about this new book. She loves it.
Your new book sounds like it could be a movie or a Netflix series. I mean, just basically the description you gave, and there's so much of the historical stuff that, especially this lost history that's being basically rediscovered, that so often lands with a movie director that decides this is a story that needs to be told, and they've got the vision for it and so on. I know that, I'm sure that you don't try to write cinematically, because that would probably cheat the book, but at the same time, there's so many books that are not at all cinematic that it's amazing that they've been made into movies, and obviously they're a completely different take on it. Hopefully, they would engage you to work on the script.
It would be wonderful if this new historical novel were made into some kind of film or television series. That would be beautiful. And I think you're right. I don't write with an eye towards that, but I think that for me the process is really kind of cinematic, because I get it so clearly in my mind, the visuals, the space, the smells, the dialogue, and then it's almost like I am just watching it, like watching the scene unfold, and then I just write it down. So for me, it is kind of a cinematic watching, but with the interiority, right? With the
Yes.
internal monologue of the first person point of view narrators, which is, I don't usually like films that use voiceover very much. It usually feels a bit heavy-handed or clunky, but in a novel, of course, that's the richness. You get to dive right into the consciousness of the characters so deeply. But yes, is the short answer. Yes, it would be incredible if the
Was
new
made into a
historical
movie. Yeah, I mean, it sounds.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I haven't seen the whole cloth, but it sounds like something that could go that route. You did say. Oh, I think I understood you correctly that you were talking about, in a sense, writing cinematically, as in you want to see what you're writing, you want to see the scenes, you want to be there, and you want to make it very present and visual. But then there's that's where the movie ends. With a book, it's at the interiority that you had mentioned. So I remember I worked with a woman who was working on, she always joked, the Great American Novel, just to make it lighthearted. But I remember she had this breakthrough, and she really, I forgot how she came across this, but the breakthrough was basically that she realized, if I treat this more like a movie or a stage play, and I think of it that way while I'm writing, and I could see the excitement in her, that she felt like this is going to be a real breakthrough for me, because it's going to make the writing more visual, more vivid, more immediate, and so on. Whether she actually ever achieved that, I don't know. But anyway, we're well over an hour, Joy, and I could just keep talking to you, but I'm going to give our listeners a little bit of a break here. I do want to tell our listeners that the program notes have all of Joy's books listed there, as well as some other information about her. So look to that. And Joy, I'll also tell you that you have a great voice, and I'm looking at your audio books, and they're not read by you.
No, they're not.
But I get that, then you have to do multiple voices and all that. I mean, if you were just doing a complete autobiography or a memoir, you have done a memoir, I could see you reading your memoir where you don't have to try to imitate male or female characters or children or what have you. But,
Right.
it's been a great... it's been a great hour and 18 minutes to spend with you, Joy. It's been really good. And
A total pleasure.
yeah, pleasure's mine. And best of luck with Flight Risk. I'm assuming the sales are probably pretty good already, because Amazon did highlighted you. So I'm imagining that it's off to a good start.
I've been amazed.
Yeah,
really,
it's been
really
good.
happy. Yeah,
Good.
Thank you.
Good, and hopefully the next one will be even a bigger smash. So thank you for the time. You've been really generous with your time, and I want to leave you, a little bit of time this evening to get some writing done as well. So, or some
Thank you
papers
so much,
graded
Mike.
or what have you. Yeah, thank you, Joy.